Well, thank you so much, Kathleen, and for the use of the hall and the wonderful introduction. And thanks to all of you for showing up on a beautiful sunny afternoon where you could be doing things more entertaining. For a quick show of hands at the beginning, I'd like to get information on where you found out about this. And so how many of you learned about it from the Prairie Lights website? Oh, okay, 3, 4, 5, something like that. How many from Facebook? Okay, about the same number. How many from publications like the Press Citizens Go, the Gazette's Hoopla, Little Village? Again, a goodly number. This is more balanced than it was last time. How many of you saw my letter to the editor in the Press Citizen last Wednesday? Thank you. All right. Yeah, everybody's a subscriber to the Press Citizen on Wednesday. And how many got an email or responded positively to that? Well, Dave back there, unfortunately, didn't bring his guitar. It'd be much more entertaining this afternoon. So I had many things in mind with this book, and I should explain that because I'm taking bits and pieces from various places in the book. Last time I stood up when I was speaking and I sat down when I was reading. This time I'm going to stand up for the whole thing and point to the book when I'm quoting from the book to make things go a little speedier. I had a lot of things in mind with this book. The details about growing up in Iowa City in the 1930s and 40s and the additional years before my first presidential appointment are not memoir for the sake of memoir. They're really designed for teenagers and their parents and teachers who care about them. Teenagers who would like to get into politics or government or whatever, but like me, come from families with no political connections, no great wealth, and what kind of path could you follow? And so that's the reason I lay out some of the things. And from that, we move on to examine two federal agencies. One is part of the executive branch called the Maritime Administration. The other is an independent regulatory commission called the Federal Communications Commission. And that leads us to their similarities and the phenomenon that explains why agencies do what they do, if you've ever wondered. And I call it the subgovernment phenomenon, which I will explain in a few minutes. And finally, we close with the best part, which is your questions and our discussion, including some suggestions on what we could do as citizens, if you care to ask me a question about that, but I don't have time to include it with this. Examples of growing up related to subsequently getting into law and government and politics. The first chapter contains a number of stories. One is about my leading one of the first sit-ins while we were in grade school at University Elementary School, demanding of our principal that we had a right to a student council, not realizing that he probably was delighted with our demand, knowing the U-High administration at the time. Another is what I learned from the autobiography of Lincoln Steffens, who was a early century muckraker, about how to go into a community and find corruption. And I thought Iowa City would be a good place to try out his thesis. And as a consequence, the Iowa City swimming pool is now located in the city park instead of on a piece of farmland owned by a member of the city council far from town. Let's see, what else? Then there was my first legal argument on behalf of a colleague. This was when I was 14, but he was old enough to drive, and he received a parking ticket. And we were pretty obviously parking in the alley. There was no question about that. So I needed to come up with a legal theory as to why that was perfectly okay. And I called it the doctrine of constructive loading. And we won. But I thought what would be most appropriate for this afternoon would be to tell you the story of my first near encounter with the Federal Communications Commission when my playmates and I were about 13 or 14 years old. We bought a 10-in-1 kit from Allied Radio in Chicago for $13. The catalog informed us that with this kit, we would be able to build from among the 10 choices a phonooscillator. This device was intended to enable the utilization of an AM radio receiver to play music from a phonograph that had no amplifier or speaker. And it plays through the radio's speaker. Now, to broadcast from the phonograph to the radio, a small antenna was to be attached to the phonooscillator. The instructions warned that one should never use more than 25 feet of antenna. Well, that was exactly the wrong thing to tell a bunch of junior high boys. So we immediately climbed out through the attic window onto the roof of my parents' home, and we began stringing up a 500-foot long antenna of braided copper wire. Now, although the voice transmission would only broadcast on unused frequencies, we discovered that when we broadcast in Morse code, the signal could be received on a car radio parked directly under the antenna of the 5,000 kilowatt local radio station WSUI on Mormon Track. Scarcely had our experiment successfully concluded when one of our members, Howard Berg, reported from Iowa City's east side that he had seen an FCC monitoring truck. We never knew the truth of that report, but I always suspected that the time it took us to turn that transmitter back into a 10-in-1 kit radio receiver would have set a record. I also attended an Iowa City Navy pre-flight training school course in Morse code, and after our near run-in with the FCC, constructed a telegraph service between my house and that of our neighbor, Irving Weber, who many of you know about, though you don't know about this. To hold the wire, my buddy Willie Weber and I pounded nails through the roof of their house, the leaks from which his mother, Martha, reminded us about for years. My mother suggested if we really wanted to talk to each other, we might just use the telephone. But mothers never understand such things. Okay, the next chapter deals with relevant experiences as a law student and a law professor, practicing lawyer. There are many stories involving the University of Texas Law School, my clerkships with U.S. Court of Appeals Judge John R. Brown, and then U.S. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, professorship at the University of California, Berkeley Law School, followed by a couple of years with a Washington law firm. But I'll just read a couple of brief excerpts from that. One involves my first day at the Supreme Court. The interview with Justice Black was really honor enough. That marble monument called the Supreme Court is one of the most beautiful and awesome buildings in Washington. When it opened, one justice is said to have refused to work there on grounds the only appropriate way to arrive would be on the back of a large white elephant. My first day, my wife pulled up to the First Street entrance to the court to let me out. Our 6-year-old daughter, Julie, who's now a little bit older and is there. Julie responded much like that justice. She took one look at the building, turned to me with a look of incredulity, and asked, "Daddy, do you work in there?" The second from that part of the career involves some insight into the corporate culture of large law firms. On November 22nd, 1963, while at lunch with a Covington partner, we heard the news that President John F. Kennedy had been shot. ABC News maintained a window on Connecticut Avenue, and we briefly watched the television report for a while. I asked the partner with whom I'd been working that morning whether we would take the afternoon off. He replied that there was entirely too much sentimentality about the assassination and that it ought to be treated like any other workday. We walked back to our 15th Street office. There are stories about Lyndon Johnson, obviously. One day I found a message on my desk at Covington. I was being asked to go to the White House to meet with Bill Moyers, one of Johnson's assistants. And we had both been at the University of Texas, same time, we're about the same age, but we didn't know each other. We'd never met, and it turned out we didn't that day either. I waited, and after 45 minutes, still no Bill Moyers. Suddenly, in bounded the bundle of smiles and energy known as Jack Valenti. He quickly introduced himself, asked that I follow him, and we went dashing through corridors of the White House. He opened the door, motioned to me to enter, sit in the straight back chair next to the door, turned, and left. When I finally settled in and looked up, I realized I was in the Oval Office of the President, alone with President Johnson. As if a forecast of things to come, he was watching a television screen in the 3-TV console given him by Dr. Frank Stanton of CBS. Well, back to the podium. The president said that he wanted me to be his maritime administrator and proceeded to tell me about the agency called MARAD, about the shipping industries and their issues. Ultimately, I accepted. It's not easy to reject Lyndon Johnson, but this interruption of my Covington commitment involved some trepidation. I hadn't known the president, any senators or House members, his Texas supporters, major donors. So now, back to the book. It was not clear why the president even knew about me, let alone wanted to appoint me to this position. Was it possible some scandal was about to break for which I'd be the fall guy? It later became more obvious that President Johnson was prescient enough to know, confronted with a short list of 15 or 20 individuals who wanted to be maritime administrator, and knowing of the ties between the industry and the agency, that the most important qualification was an individual who did not want the job. That was apparently my only qualification. The Maritime Administration was then part of the Department of Commerce, headed by Secretary Luther Hodges. Since I had never held any government job except for the clerkships, knew nothing of shipping, shipbuilding, or ports, not to mention management and administration of agencies, I asked Hodges if there was a training program, or at least perhaps a manual, for new presidential appointees. There wasn't. I followed up by asking if he had any advice for me. Yes, he said, just remember to pee every chance you get. You will find the Myriad stories entertaining. For now, I'll just share the basics. This is back here. It turns out that American shipping was so inefficient that both the shipbuilding and operating costs ran twice those of other countries. The difference was paid in cash by grateful taxpayers in what was called a differential subsidy. The Senate and House cost cutters thought this a good place to start. But the shipping industry argued the subsidy helped retain shipbuilding capacity and control of our imports and exports. So confident was the industry of its value that it contracted for an independent economic study. The report considered all aspects of shipping's economic impact, such as employment, movement of goods, balance of payments. The economist's conclusion? The last sentence of the last paragraph of the last chapter said, in effect, and thus we find there is no economic value of the United States Merchant Marine. Back here. I wanted to get back to Covington to finish my obligations there and then return to Berkeley. And the president knew it. Another invitation to the White House. Johnson emerged from the bedroom, took me across the hall to a small dining room, and ordered a cup of Sanka for both of us. He was relaxed and in good spirits. He thanked me for my work at the Maritime Administration and said he understood that I wanted to leave government. However, it was his view, shared by several advisors, that I should not be permitted to leave. He wanted me to serve as an FCC commissioner. Did the president know what he was doing? The speculation persists that he was surprised by my performance as an FCC commissioner. I don't think so. He had felt the pressure that flowed from my term as maritime administrator. He not only had the option, but he had my request to leave. He had to know what I would do. As the years wore on, beyond 1968 to 1974, it seemed increasingly likely that I just might be the last remaining bit of evidence that Lyndon Johnson did, after all, have a sense of humor. Back here. I could talk about the FCC for hours, but of only another 10 or 15 minutes, if that, okay? So I'm going to skip the FCC decisions, I'm going to describe the facilities and the management, and then let your imagination flow from that as to what decisions probably came out of it. And then I'll give you a real short thing from one of them. When I took my first trip to the FCC, I told the driver to take me to the new post office building. He shot back, "Mister, there ain't no new post office building." Well, he was right. We ultimately found the building, a 1930s effort, at 13th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. The FCC offices were in the attic. The spillover was a couple blocks away over a delicatessen on 12th Street. The dingy yellow hallways had burned out light bulbs and stacks of file boxes along the walls. It turned out the FCC has more cubic feet of paper per employee than any agency in Washington. The commission's seal, a bird and some wires stretched between towers, did little more to suggest the world of television and communication satellites the president had told me about. When my new secretary, Doris Coles, arrived, we still had no supplies. So Doris and I decided we would pay a visit to the keepers of the supply room. We began by asking for items sure to be on hand in any agency consuming as much paper as the FCC, paper clips and number 2 pencils. The FCC was out of paper clips and had been for some time, we were told. Pencils? No one seemed to know where they were. Doris suggested we look in some metal cabinets. Her instincts were good, but the supplies were incomplete. There were number 1, 3, and 4 pencils, but no number 2. Upon inquiry, it turned out that they had never been instructed to maintain inventories or automatic ordering procedures, and that they quite often ran out of stock. None of my colleagues either understood or thought much of my suggestion that we adopt inventory control procedures, and so nothing was done. Later, I discovered no one kept track of our postage-free envelopes either, and we apparently owed our landlord, Postmaster General Larry O'Brien, $500,000 in back postage. I will share 3 brief quotes from a dissent I wrote. I spent most of my time writing dissenting opinions, about 400 of them. So this is one about Esther Blodgett, a licensed radio station owner who refused to obey FCC regulations and deadlines. Before us today is the saga of an 11-year battle of wits between this 34-year-old federal bureaucratic institution and a wily septuagenarian woman born and raised in the heartland of the Midwest. Judging from the conclusion reached by the majority today, the woman appears to have won. For all of our studied leniency, Miss Blodgett continues to plod along at her own chosen pace, filing requisite forms from the commission whenever the fancy seems to strike her. The majority's decision today only confirms what must have been suspected by Miss Blodgett all along. However long she waited to reply to a notice of violation, the worst that could happen would be an increase in postal rates. Oh, and that new post office building, when you're in Washington, tell your driver it's now called the Trump International Hotel. Subgovernments. First, know that subgovernments have nothing in common with a conspiracy theorist deep state. As I studied and wrote and taught and then experienced administrative law and practice, my perception of government radically changed. In a government with 4,000 presidential appointees and 8 million federal and contract employees, only a small portion of the power in Washington resides in the Oval Office or the chambers of the House and Senate. It's mostly with those whose daily work involves a single industry, like shipping or broadcasting. Those who work within the departments, the bureaus, the offices and agencies in the executive branch, and the independent regulatory commissions. But even they, excuse me, that's what the water is for, Kathleen, thank you. But even they cannot do it alone. They need and are but one component of that industry's subgovernment. Why were the shipping and shipbuilding industries able to perpetuate for decades these subsidies? Subsidies that the Secretary of Defense said had no military value, and economists said had no economic value because of their subgovernment. Not all agencies are part of a subgovernment. So what are the most favorable growing conditions? An agency focused on, and I'm just speaking this entire chapter because I don't have time for the details, but you'll find them very interesting. So what you have is an agency that's focused on a single industry, preferably one dominated by a few firms like an oligopoly. But this excludes units like the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission because they're dealing with our entire economy, not just a single industry. Second, an agency with the legal power and discretion to create great wealth for those firms. Not just cash like agricultural and maritime subsidies. It may involve price setting, think milk, rate setting, think phone bills back in my day. Tariffs, think Trump this day. Tax breaks, cheap use of public lands, approval of mergers, safety standards, think dead coal miners, weakened environmental standards, think water, government contracts, think $17 billion for a single aircraft carrier. Third, the industry can usually find one person who's college educated, ethically pure, and likable enough to perform as its spokesperson when required. That was Frank Stanton. Fourth, there is a trade association such as the National Association of Broadcasters. Fifth, there is the industry's very important trade press, such as Broadcasting Magazine or the Oil and Gas Journal. This serves as their equivalent of members-only social media today. Was back then but the trade press still exists. Why is that important? Because trade magazine journalists can get information from the agency before the company lawyers can, for one thing. And it's the sole source of such information. There are too many subgovernments for the mainstream media to cover what all of them are up to. Six, their lawyers usually have a bar association of their own, such as the Federal Communications Bar Association. Seventh, subcommittee staff. The House and Senate delegate substantive areas, such as shipping or broadcasting, first to committees, which in turn delegate to subcommittees, which in turn leave most of the control to the chair, who in turn delegates most of the work and industry relationships to a staff member. Okay, so in the case of broadcasting, that responsibility went to the Senate Commerce Committee, which delegated it to its Communications Subcommittee, which kind of turned it over to the chair, Senator John Pastore of Rhode Island, who had his staffer, Nicholas Zappel, take care of it. What turns these various components, oligopoly, wealth-creating agency, spokesperson, trade association, trade press, specialized bar association, congressional subcommittee staff, what turns that into a lean, mean protection machine? Back to the book. Some of the most important qualities of subgovernments are their group pressures, sociological makeup, and members' interpersonal relationships. Most subgovernment gatherings are free to attendees, half paid for by corporate employers and half paid for by taxpayers as ordinary and necessary business expenses. It makes little difference who puts on the event. National Association of Broadcasters, NBC, Broadcasting Magazine, the Broadcasters Club, or Federal Communications Bar Association. Regardless of the ostensible sponsor, they are all subgovernment events, bringing together the same people eating the same shrimp. Subgovernment members' professional and social lives are intertwined. They can move freely from one broadcasting subgovernment institution to another. A publicist or a journalist might go to the FCC and then go to a network or to a congressional office. It is incestuous. They literally intermarry. Well, never mind. I don't have time for the. There are a couple of illustrations that are just unbelievable. This helps subgovernments become even more self-protective and insular than they otherwise might be. Always at the ready when the wagons need circular placement. I'm going to take questions about what I've said so far, which ought to have raised a few questions and doubts and suspicions and hostilities in your mind. And then there's the final chapter on some proposals for reform, which we can get into if you're interested in that also. So, who's first up? Come after the old man.
Well, I would like to know, first of all, for your student government that in grade school, did you then take office? And if so, what office did you hold and what groundbreaking changes did you bring about to the grade school?
I am sorry to have to confess that at the age of 85, those details have escaped me. The fact that we did it, I recorded when I put this manuscript together years ago. Yeah.
All right. You'd probably remember if it was a dress code change or something. Yeah.
No, we didn't have a dress code. It was a wonderful school. That's why they closed it. They asked me to give the last commencement address. That, for any interested in the history of UHI, I'd be happy to share that with you. Send me an email.
I'm more interested in what should we do about it, because we're in a mess here with Trump, and it seems like he's off. And if we're letting an insane man run the world, which the United States runs the world, what can we do about it? Because Congress doesn't seem to be interested in it.
Good question. What can we do about it? This really is a different day from what it is I was writing about in the. I was on the commission from 1966, 1973, and so now we really do have far greater challenges in the subgovernment. Back in that day, the people appointed to head the agencies, at least most of them, and I would say virtually all of the civil servants working in the agencies had some sense of public obligation and the mission of their agency. That got withered away and reduced with industry capture in what I call the sub-government, but it was still there. And now the whole point is to stack the judiciary with right-wing approved judges and justices, and the agencies with people who've spent their lives trying to destroy the agency and are now given the opportunity to do so. But I think that, who was it who said every movement for social change begins with a single person? There's no other way to do it. There's at least a half a dozen of you can give me that name. No, apparently not. All right. Okay, I'll claim it as my own idea. But that's true. And the basics are things that many of you in this room have done. The thing that I would like to see more people do is to, if you have the time, if you are retired or it's compatible with your job, or you just have so much passion you're going to do it anyway even though you shouldn't devote time to it, adopt an agency or institution. How many of you subscribe to the Gazette? Yeah, well, the others of you ought to. It's really, I think it's probably the best paper in the United States for the area that, the population that it serves. But those of you who do read the Gazette know about Vanessa Miller and her investigative journalism with regard to the University of Iowa in general and the UIHC in particular. And without her, there is no way you would know that stuff. That's the only way you would know it. Rod Sullivan, a supervisor on Johnson County Board of Supervisors, has complained that there are many supervisors' meetings and there's nobody there from the media. And the newspapers have taken a hit over the last decade or two. Now many have closed down. Those that are still in business have cut their staff in half. Their advertising revenues declined by 50%. They're really struggling. There are many ways you can get national and international news. I have normally in my pocket, now hopefully in my bag, on my phone, probably 20 newspapers around the world. South China Morning Post. If I want to know about Kurdistan, I look at Rudaw, which is their equivalent, the Associated Press, Le Monde in Paris, Guardian from London, and so forth. The real problem, and I'm going to write a book about this someday, but it's going to be hopefully before I die, but it's going to take years to finish this one. And that so the real problem is not just newspapers, not just journalism. It's local journalism is the problem. And it would help if we were all journalists, but we're not. And we can do what we can do. And what we can do is somebody decide, I'm going to go to every meeting of the Johnson County Board of Supervisors, and I'm going to take notes. And I'm going to put my notes up on my blog, and I'm going to write columns and letters to the editor, and I'm going to try to get organizations in town to coalesce around these issues and have a MailChimp distribution system, get the news out to people and whatever. And a single person can do that. I mean, a single person can reform the Johnson County Board of Supervisors. Somebody else take on the city council. Somebody else take on the zoning board. Somebody else take on the school board. You can do that. Somebody else take on each of our elected officials, our 2 U.S. senators and 1 member of Congress, our members of the House and Senate in Iowa, the governor, and you just take that on as your job, and do this. So that's one of the most powerful things I think you could do. If you're a teacher or a journalist, consider bringing this kind of information to your students. I think one of the most academically valuable, I mean, I've got to justify it by that standard. Bear in mind, why did we create what were 4 and then 6 and then 8 years of education and then finally decide around the turn of the century, 12 years were required. And apparently, according to the Iowa legislature, the intervening 119 years does not justify adding another 2 years to that K-12. Seems to me that it would. But to get students out of the classroom, into the community, let them see the effect of their work. We created these schools starting back in the 1600s because we wanted the citizens of the country to be trained in civics, in government, in their role as members of a democratic society. And you look at here we're supposed to be the People's Republic of Johnson County, and we can't get more than 5 or 10%. Well, only about 75% of the people who could register to vote do. Of those few who do register to vote, oftentimes no more than 5, 8, 10, 12% come out for a city council or school board or bond vote or whatever. We've got a lot of work to do in our schools. Well, I could go on and on with every, and of course, if you want to do something with the broadcasters, to at least take some notes and know about the fact they have to have a public file, look at that public file, look at their employment practices and how much diversity they have in their, that was one of the things I came down on heavy when I was at the commission, was minority ownership of stations, because that makes a difference, and minorities in front of the camera as well as behind the camera. And that, I think, made a bit of a difference. There are other things I write about in the book that I think would help with Congress in a more normal state of American government, and what they could do in investigating potential appointees to these lower positions that just tend to go through without much consideration, and make sure we have qualified people in those positions. Okay, I talked too long, which is my one.
Oh, no, that was fine. Do you want to, you talked about reading another section or talking about another section. Do you want to do that, or do you want to keep going with?
Oh, no, that was the section I just spoke about.
Okay.
So I think they've had probably more than they wanted on
We've
that.
got a question over here.
Hello, I've got a question.
Yeah.
What happened to the fairness doctrine, and do you think its absence is where we're at today? And I'm very dismayed when I think most people get their news and information from the state-run Fox News.
Well, I don't have time to go into the whole history of David Koch just died, and to put together what was planned from the late 70s, early 80s on through to the present time, to try to alter America's direction with regard to higher education and all kinds of things, putting people in office, but particularly affecting these appointments and the media. And you're right on with that about the fairness doctrine. Journalists really liked the fairness doctrine. National Association of Broadcasters did not, because they used it as a fundraising appeal, very much like what the NRA does with regard to guns. But the people who worked in journalism in radio and television thought it was just terrific, because what it did was it kept the advertising department out of the news department. The fairness doctrine did not require anything more than what any professional journalist would do. It had two requirements. One, you must do some programming about public issues of public importance in your community of license. It didn't say how much or whatever, but just do something, but besides a jukebox with commercials, okay? So you have to deal with controversial local issues. Number two, in dealing with them, you have to give some opportunity for the presentation of a range of views on that issue. It's not an equal amount of time. It's not that the leader of the organization who opposes what's going on wants to be on your station. You don't have to put them on. You can have one of your own reporters say it. But it's just that you take your public responsibility seriously, because this was considered, the airwaves were considered public property. The only standard the FCC had in licensing is that the broadcaster served the public interest, and that included the concept of informing the local community of what's going on. In many ways, it was very much like the role of a member of Congress. You are not guaranteed re-election. 97% of those who want to be reelected are reelected, but you're not guaranteed to be reelected. You're not guaranteed to get your license renewed, which in my time was a 3-year license. Over 97% of them did get renewed, which created lots of dissents, but it's not a matter of right. Well, this was very destructive. It made it more difficult for those who were trying to swing the media more to the right. So they got rid of the fairness doctrine. They repealed it. Well, that means you can have right or left. You can have one talk show person after another, after another, after another, of just one viewpoint on your station. That's exactly what they did. It made Rush Limbaugh. Back in the 1920s, under the Radio Commission, before it was called FCC, people lost their licenses for things much less severe than what Rush Limbaugh was doing every day. So it's been part of a plan, and with that went restriction. We had a restriction on, you could own, I believe, 7 a.m. and 7 FM stations, and then if you owned UHF television stations, you could have a couple more TV, but I think it was like 3 or 5 or something. It was very limited. And the whole thrust behind that was, we want diversity, we want democracy, we want a lot of views out there. We want this to be really controlled by the people in the local community. And that was very much the philosophy. In fact, a member of the Congress, when the act was first passed, on the floor of the House said, if we should ever allow such a powerful and this was when it was a mysterious voice coming out of the box. Nobody knew how it was working. And he was able to project and see this. If we should ever allow so powerful a medium for the manipulation of citizens to fall into the hands of the few, then woe be to those who would dare to disagree with him. And that is exactly what's happened. He was right on the money. Okay, enough of that. What else we got? Katya.
Hello, thank you. This is just a general question. What made you decide to come back to Iowa City and get involved in academia? And a broader question, what do you feel for the future of our institution here as a public institution? Thank you.
Oh. Well, let's see. Anybody was planning on going to dinner tonight? Well, I came back for a variety of reasons. In terms of academia, I started off with the idea I was going to be a law professor. After clerking for Justice Black, I got back in those days, you didn't have to present a paper and answer all kinds of questions. Bill Prosser, a torts professor at the University of California, Bolt Hall, was dean out there. And he just picked up the phone and called me at the Supreme Court one day and said, "Hey, Nick, I'd like to have you come out here and teach law." And I said, "Well, where's Berkeley?" And he said, "Well, it's in California." I'd never been there. I looked on a map. I thought, "Oh, this is wonderful. Look, all this green around and this little tiny dot that's Berkeley. Apparently it's in the forest somewhere." You know, well, no, there was Tilden Regional Park on up the mountain, but Berkeley was not in the forest. But I accepted the job before I went out there. I mean, it was a good school. And But that was as Shelley knows from the present day, the process we go through to hire professors is nothing like that, nor the power of deans in anything like that. So that was I went to Covington and Berlin. They offered me a job when I graduated from law school, and I said no. Then after my clerkship with Judge Brown, I said no. Then after my clerkship with Justice Black, I said no. Then after I arrived in California, I said no. Then they kept writing me and offering me jobs. So I made these outrageous demands. And I figured, well, this will quiet this. You know, they'll be the end of it. I won't have to hear from them anymore. And I won't even recite them. It's so embarrassing. But back by return mail came letter, terms accepted. It included paying my way there and back to Berkeley again. And I would only be there 2 years, and I would get to choose my cases and all like that. And I decided it would be helpful in teaching administrative law. So that was really academically based. And then Lyndon Johnson intervening was not at all on my plate at that time. I mean, it had been kind of in the background. In Herndon's Life of Lincoln, he quotes Lincoln as saying, "I will prepare myself and my chance will come." And so I was preparing myself, but God knows for what. I mean, I thought maybe I'd go into foreign service. So after my FCC term was done, and I stayed in Washington for a while, and I was doing lecturing and writing and running the National Citizens Committee for Broadcasting, and running in a Democratic primary in the old 3rd District and whatever. But my mother had cancer, and I was, when I left Washington, I went first to Madison. It offered me a distinguished visiting professorship for a semester or a year, I don't remember, and I did that. And then Greg and I decided that we wanted to come back to Iowa City because of Mother. And Bill Hines was dean of the law school at that time. And he called me. It was another one of those kind of deals. "Hey, Nick, I hear you're in town. You got to come over here and teach something." So we decided what it would be, and that's how all that came about.
How would you say public access has held up over the years? What would you say about its contribution to sub-government?
Public access was one of the only time, I think, I ever sold my vote for something called log rolling in the Iowa legislature. And that was the cable television rules, which had been cooked up by President Nixon and Barry Goldwater's campaign advisor, who was chair of the FCC at the time, and who else, I don't know. I didn't like particularly, but they were going to pass, and it was going to be 6-1, and they really wanted them to be unanimous. And so I said, well, I've got a deal for you. I think we should require all the cable companies to make channels available for free for local government, educational institutions, and the public. So public access was then required of the cable companies. And then we had some legal problems with it, and it came back, and there was legislation and so forth. But it ultimately stayed in being, and we had such a system here. And the cable company paid for it. And we had channel for the city government, for the senior center, for the Iowa City Public, the community school district, for the university, for Kirkwood, and then public access television, which is located, you all know where Uptown Bill's is, I hope, and if not, Mary will tell you where, I don't know where she is right now, but she's here, she's in the back. But in the basement of Uptown Bill's is what's called PATV, Public Access Television. Anybody in Iowa City could go in there, and originally it was done out of the Iowa City Public Library. but then it moved into their headquarters. Anybody could, at that early time, go into the Iowa City Public Library, take some training courses on how to operate this equipment, way back when it was a mystery to everybody, and walk on the library with $5,000 worth of equipment and go make their own TV shows. And then it evolved. Well, now, you say sub-government, the cable companies in Iowa got together, and I don't know what it cost them, but they got the Iowa legislature to say cities could no longer control this. It had to be controlled statewide. And so guess who the statewide listened to? And so now cities don't have that control anymore. And PATV in Iowa City is not in terrific shape now that Mediacom doesn't have to pay for what formerly they agreed to pay for and what I demanded in exchange for my vote. Maybe I can sue somebody, get my vote back, and I'll write a posthumous dissenting opinion to the cable
All right.
rules.
I think that's about all the time we have today, but Nicholas Johnson will be happy to talk with you further and sign books for you. Thank you so much for the great talk and for all of your work.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, all of you. I really appreciate you coming out. That was very nice.